Whenever you're ready.
At the end of this debate, you will believe that the world will be awash with EVs and electric cars and good environmental batteries, that the prices on average will be much lower, and there will be far less price instability. First on setup, then on why this leads to an overall global reduction in costs. Finally, why this leads to an increased instability in the price of lithium. First, to explain what these rare earth metals are. It's mostly lithium and cobalt, there may be others, but secondly, these rare earth metals are usually used in EVs, electric vehicles, batteries, AI chips, those sorts of things. The second thing is to explain what the investment to do this has come from in the status quo, which is one, mostly the United States has recently invested huge amounts in these refining facilities in Australia. And the main reason why is that, like, to get around the tariffs on Chinese refinements of lithium and stuff in China in the first place. You know, if they know about it, they've read about it in international newspapers. They know that Australia specifically has had much lower tariff rates than other countries. But the second thing is a lot of investments also come from other mining companies due to a large amount of iron booms and the increase in price of global iron overall. They've had a large amount of spare capital and wanted to invest in other industries. This first argument will explain why Australia has a large comparative advantage in the refinement of lithium, and that therefore this will lead to a reduction in global price. First is to explain the problem with and main costs of import of refining rare metals. There are two things to know. One, refinement is a low labor input industry. The reason why is firstly, it's become highly automated over time. Like, it's not like a bunch of individuals just pick out a rock until they get the lithium out of it anymore. It's you need lots of chemical processing and extracting in order to mix with the lithium in order to extract out the metal. But secondly, obviously, like the more automated and sciencey it is, the more you're able to yield out of each kilogram or ton of metal. Which means that what you need is lots of highly skilled engineers and scientists running these production lines, doing maintenance on this equipment, not like a bunch of random individuals. Which means that any benefits of like China has a low labor cost don't really apply as much in debate, and what you more should value is the high input forms of labor, like lots of scientists and engineers. The second is the transportation costs are a massive cost. This is because one, you need to get the mine to the production facility, and you need to get the production facility to everywhere else on the globe, which would point out like basically everyone everywhere on Earth has a demand for this mineral. Cool. Why does Australia have a large comparative advantage? The first is to point out that the large already existing mining industry leads to cross-pollination into other industries, specifically refinement. This is because, firstly, there's a huge amount of investment in university metallurgy as an academic scientist, and a lot of scientists that have studied in university for their entire lives, metallurgy, the science behind metals, those sorts of things, which is very helpful for mining, but it's pretty easy to cross-apply over to like refinement processes. The second thing is that because of Australia's lots of programs in STEM, in having a lot of people do STEM degrees cheaper, and especially a wider mining industry pushing funding into metallurgy programs, means that we have lots of really highly educated and smart chemists and scientists like Auguste, for example. The second argument to explain is that it's very easy to build these refinement facilities. This is because, firstly, a bunch of coal refining facilities have shut down because of the drop in price in coal over time, which means that literally these warehouses exist. Secondly, lots of industrial equipment is on the cheap because other things like coal and paper mills and stuff like that have shut down, which like you could scrap it for metal, like the initial startup cost isn't that high, but thirdly, there's just lots of expertise already in this industry that's recently found themselves out of control because of the collapse in the paper and coal industry, which means that like, you know, factory management has like, there's a bunch of workers there ready to help you manage and plan your factory design and space. The third reason why is that we have incredibly low transportation costs. This is because, firstly, because of our existing mining industry already to export raw minerals, like you could just, and they have to export from mines to major cities with ports and stuff like that, we already have like all the important infrastructure. Our roads are already built to carry hundreds of tons of minerals every day across those special roads. We already have ports that are designed to carry huge amounts of tonnage and cargo every single day, especially in rural and remote areas where a lot of these mines already exist, where labour costs are low, where people are willing to transport to in the first place, which means that the cost of transportation is incredibly low in Australia. I would make this comparative to China, which has seen massive increase in transportation costs. This is because firstly, the Pearl River Delta and the Shanghai ports have become massively congested in recent years because of the huge increase in domestic demand for other goods, which means the cost of transporting raw lithium to these countries have increased exponentially. And secondly, because of the construction collapse in China, it means they haven't been able to expand ports nearly as much as they wanted to recently. And finally, because of the US tariffs, there's lots of demand for other forms of imports. So it's hard to reach like the tipping point in order to justify a port expansion in like Tianjin, for example. What is the impact of this argument? Why does it win us debate? This is because if Australia is able to invest in this, there is a relatively low startup cost, and in the long run will become more efficient and better at producing EVs. This has an advantage because firstly, we reduce the global price of lithium, which is incredibly good. Firstly, it's used in a huge amount of industries. It's used in green industries, it's used in AI chips, it's used in green tech and that sort of thing, which means all around the world, you get a reduction in the price of these things. Often this is the difference between someone who chooses to buy a gas car or someone chooses to buy an EV is literally $1,000, or is a slightly lower repayment each month, which means there's more people buy this up. But secondly, it means that Australia can now, Chinese refineries have to compete against Australian refineries, which leads to a competition incentive in the long run to a lower price. Thirdly, just arbitrage, because it's very cheap to export. Now all around the world, people are able to access green technology cheaper. But the second big impact is this is incredibly good for the environment. Because way more people are using EVs and using batteries to store electricity, this means that anthropogenic climate change slows down. This means that when more people buy electric cars, the rate of fossil gas emissions decrease into the future. But the final major impact is to point out the innovation, which is that because Australia has uniquely, incredibly good chemists and engineers and scientists in this field, this means that we're able to advance far quicker in our ability to refine more efficiently lithium. And I know currently the status quo, the lithium refinement process is quite bad for the environment and produces a bunch of extra chemicals. If we're able to improve our incentives in order to, improve our innovation in order to reduce the environmental cost, that has a good long run thing. Again, I'll compare this to China, which currently has basically no proper environmental regulations that exist in that industry, or far lower incentive because they're not a democratic society, because there's basically no Greens party or lobbying group there. Whilst in Australia, we do have a Greens party that makes us do shitty things like, like environmental protections and that woke shit, which means that it's great for our natural beauty and environment here, which is something you ought to protect and weigh into the long run. But second argument is going to, and we get higher yields if there's more innovation, because you could suck more blood from the same stone. But let's say you don't believe that argument, we're going to explain why we have far higher price stability. The first is to explain that other places are unlikely to receive investments in refining. This is because, firstly, the two other big producers of lithium, Chile and Argentina, don't have very good financial records, pretty corrupt governments that have a lack of institutional support. Argentinian government has failed like 5 IMF bailouts in a row. No one wants to fucking invest in that. Obviously, Australia, we're a pretty good country. We pay back our debts. We're probably a decent creditor to work with. But secondly is that, obviously, our exclusive benefit is you get an Australian competition, which means firstly, there's that competition incentive for earlier, but secondly, you're insulated from supply shocks in China or supply shocks from other places in the refinement process. Why is supply shocks something that are particularly likely and you should weigh highly? Firstly, the CCP is invested themselves in their SOEs that run the refinement process. What that means is the Communist Party also owns the refinement industry, which means that they could use that refinement industry to their political ends, which is incredibly bad for price stability, because for example, if a country does something that China doesn't like, they could artificially increase the price in the long run, or if the Chinese government needs an increase in tax revenue, they can artificially raise the prices. Secondly, the US-Chinese trade war is probably going to continue in the future because both the Democrats and Republicans hate China, which means that there's likely to be increased shocks in price. And thirdly, the increase in demand for AI chips means in the future there's going to be more and more shock for increase in price in lithium. This means that one, you need to hedge less against the price of lithium increasing, and secondly, people are more comfortable investing in lithium-heavy industries because they don't know there won't be surges in prices. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
No, I have to figure out which of these buttons is the one to reset it. Okay, that works. I got it. All right.
Swipe across.
Yeah, I also have it on time kept because you have to be it's a black magic where if you don't do a certain set of things, it won't work. Thanks, first Affirmative, for that speech. First negative to open the standard portion of side negatives case. Here.
this is an awful lot of money being used for something which we don't have guaranteed benefits for, which China could just end up doing better than us. And we seem to ignore the issues that could be caused by this very same initiative that are far more devastating than what the benefits could bring. First, like some setup, obviously globally we control a very small proportion of reserves. Like China has way more, like it has I believe 2.5 million tons of tungsten and we only have 400,000. Yes, I know tungsten is not a rare earth metal, thank you, but I'm just giving an example, okay? Secondly, the status quo for refining in China is large and then it is growing in other countries such as Indonesia as well. This means that they have the first mover advantage in terms of infrastructure, and that means that they often have like the better engineers and the experts on the topic, like you said, the US as well. And then the next thing to note is that what we mean when we say aggressively growing is that they're going to have to cut money from other places because they're using a large proportion of funding onto this. They're going to do things like specific tax concessions for involved companies and partially or directly subsidize the industry in its entirety. And of course, like we agree with you when you say it's used for things like lithium batteries, which help subsidize EV cars, and then like semiconductor production as well. First off, their wine is extremely expensive beyond your comprehension. 6 reasons for this. First, Australia already has high energy costs and Australia has done a particularly bad job transitioning to like a new electrical grid. Like obviously, Australia already has a very expensive transitional like energy grid. I think that's quite OIV, like transition lines are quite expensive. For example, if he wants to build a bunch of solar panels over a coal mine, that's going to be particularly uncomfortable. Like if he wants to build a large proportion of solar panels like near farmland, farmers would fear this like because their farmlands would catch fire, and this is an often unpopular opinion. Australia just get a large proportion of its electricity just from gas, and gas in Australia is connected to the international market, meaning it's quite expensive. All in all, electricity in Australia is quite expensive compared to like other countries like China. But then again, labor costs themselves are quite high because Australia has quite powerful unions. Even if there is a low labor input, this still matters because the labor costs are from very expensive engineers and they're like paid very highly in the US. I think mining engineers are paid like 500 grand. I think that's a lot of money. Thirdly, on infrastructure, first off, it's really hard to obtain when you don't have pre-existing infrastructure. Saying the same infrastructure for mining applies to like refining is completely ridiculous. It's like saying hydropower infrastructure applies to sewage treatment. It's not the same thing because it sounds like the same thing. For refining, you need some completely different sets of tanks and like transition things, especially considering a large proportion of these chemicals like cobalt are highly volatile, and that means that you cannot just store them in the same warehouses as well. Like if you use a warehouse to store coal, you cannot just bring cobalt in there. Cobalt is highly reactive. You can't just put it in a warehouse which has like coal like the radiation from coal, if that makes sense. But also fourthly, we have a lack of engineering capacity in Australia. Like I guess like engineering in Australia already does pay 500 grand for mining engineers, but at the same time, a majority of engineers are not mining engineers. I can tell you, I'm an engineer, I'm not looking to go into mining. It sounds awful. There are just a certain subsection of people who will not go into mining, and even if they do, there is like not sufficient refining in Australia. There's not sufficient expertise, meaning we're going to have to bring people in from the US or like from countries which have expertise. This is going to be incredibly expensive, like in order to bring in skilled labor and for them to have to slowly age by year teach our people in Australia how to perfect this industry and how to do it well. It's going to take a long time to do. And then fifthly, like we're not gonna do the end step of production. We're not gonna make it to retail. We're not gonna make it to the retail step. If you're gonna make semiconductors, for instance, you're gonna have to ship to TSMC in Taiwan. This is where all the semiconductors are made before they're sent off to like AMD or Nvidia. Or you could send it off to Korea as well. And it's significantly more expensive for us to ship to these countries because the current distribution networks, partly subsidized by China by the way, are for our shipping companies from our ports to take the minerals to China. And obviously once we announce that we are going to make this initiative over a certain period of time, that then gives China time to expand their lithium mines, to expand their cobalt mines. Their mines are not working at their maximum capacity. They can probably make up for the difference within the span of 5 to 10 years which we have to set up these refining plants. Or let's be honest, it's probably going to take like 20 years and a lot of money. Now the government is also likely to do this extremely inefficiently. We know projects like the Snowy Hydro project have been done like insanely inefficiently, like money-wise. It's unclear why the government is a rational or a good actor in order to make this do this well. Then what are the impacts of this? Obviously these tax concessions and subsidies by the the Australian government have to take money out of somewhere else, right? We see them taking money out of like disability checks as they have already done previously. We don't think it's unlikely that they have to take money out of somewhere, whether it's Medicare or wherever it is. Obviously this is gonna hurt like the marginalized communities. Like for example, they think we already give a certain proportion of like returns governance through disability checks. So they have previously reduced the disability check amount. This has been an unpopular opinion, sure, but you have to cut from somewhere. They thought this was a reasonable place to cut. I see no reason why you can't just cut from indigenous communities in the future. Now, just to talk about price shocks, if China is in a good position, like regardless of what's going on in China, our thing is just so much more expensive. Just think to yourself intuitively, China is going to spend so much more money, essentially fixing. They have the first mover advantage, they have the infrastructure, they are going to be the ones who sell it for cheap. And if they sell it for cheap, we have to match that price in order to sell it for cheap as well. Like, we're not going to sell it for cheap. Oh, we are going to be the ones who end up making EVs more expensive because our lithium is going to be more expensive comparatively, or we're going to get out-competed, by which we have to go for a lower price margin. And what happens when we go for a lower price margin? All of this is for nothing because we don't make enough returns. And if we do go for a large, of course, if we do go for a large selling price, what this means is essentially that EVs and inflation go up in price because we're selling it at a higher margin. Essentially, now they tell us a lot about how this subsidization of EVs and stuff is good for the environment. First, I'm going to explain why it isn't, and secondly, why we probably don't get it anyway. Let's think about EVs for a second. Sure, EVs are good because they don't produce carbon dioxide and send it off into the environment. How amazing! But the thing is, when you take the cradle to grave cost, that is the cost from production to the end of the EV, there's a very different story here. Because obviously, the lithium batteries used are ones that don't biodegrade and are particularly bad for the environment. If these are stuffed into landfills, or the giant metal machines that are EVs are stuffed into landfills, this is going to have trickle-down effects on the environment. So when you take EVs as a whole, they are more destructive, or as destructive as regular cars. We don't see this as a net win for the environment, only for the production of CO2. Secondly, countries like China probably will do the production itself efficiently, considering the Paris Climate Agreement exists. China has put forward plans on how it will reduce and minimize its consumption and output of CO2 into the environment. We think it is a good actor to do this, considering that it has been taking initiatives in the status quo in order to reduce its environmental output. But then talking about price shocks and stuff, this is not going to happen because we already tell you that we are likely to not pay more than market value. But even if we do pay more than market value, this will lead to inflation. It's unclear why, considering that we're going to ship to Taiwan anyway, considering that we're going to ship to China anyway, the final step of production is not going to happen here. Why companies in the US, where they build massive power grids of energy grids, or I just mean AI production plants or AI generation plants, why these plants wouldn't just take the chips from China, and why the tariffs wouldn't apply during the final step of production when you're moving into the US. I'm unclear why this won't stop price shocks. Obviously, if the US continues to impose huge tariffs on China, we are still liable by proxy to those shocks. I don't think this solves the issue, but we have a very certain benefit, unlike the environmental stuff and the price shock stuff. We have a very certain benefit that they will cut money from somewhere. That's going to hurt the average Australian, and it's going to disproportionately hurt those who are disabled, those who are indigenous, because this is where the government has tended to cut funding. We believe this is the most certain and worst impact, and by that proxy we win this debate.
Thanks, First Negative, for that fine speech. I'd love to welcome up the second affirmative to continue the substantive portion of Side Affirmative's case. Here.
Auguste, could I have you record my speech?
Yeah.
Audio as well.
It also will be uploaded to the
Yeah,
YouTube, but I understand if you want a voice recording.
Wait, you just messing with
Yeah. I'll just start the recording now.
The first thing I'll note in this speech is that all of Negative's benefits only activate if you believe that the money is likely to be spent in a better way in the counterfactual. This team does not do sufficient work to prove that is likely. What Ziggy explains to you at first is that empirically the people who have been spending the most money on this investment in Australia are US investors. The reason for this is that it's very unclear why the Australian government specifically has an incentive to put lots of money into this domestic industry. It's very clear why the US has an incentive for this, because they want to put lots of tariffs on China, because they have put lots of tariffs on China, and because they are suffering because of the amount of rare earths they're required to import from China. They have a massive incentive to have more refinement of rare earths and more production of rare earths outside of China. They like Australia, they choose to do it in Australia. This is why they put so much investment into this. Australia does not lose all that much money there. We think that we can explain that it's probably likely that this money will alternatively be spent on not very good things. That is, the private investment money in the US would likely alternatively just go to NVIDIA, it would likely alternatively just go to various other AI ventures. It's unclear why those AI ventures are particularly useful. We think those are probably just the more vacuous sort of AI ventures rather than the useful AI ventures. And alternatively, public money, I don't know, probably just like goes to funding Israel or something. I don't think I really want Trump to have all that money to spend the way he wants. I think it's probably likely that the counterfactual isn't that we just take away from a bunch of disadvantaged communities. Even if you believe it's true that the Australian government has sacrificed a bunch of money, I think it's deeply unlikely they sacrificed all that money from Indigenous people specifically. And the reason for this is quite intuitive, which is that people get quite pissed off when you take a bunch of money away from people who are suffering. This is why the sort of like NDIS cuts are perhaps quite controversial. But we'd also explain that it's probably true that the Labor government in particular has like quite a strong incentive to appease these communities. This is where they get their votes, this is where they get their government. They don't want to win the next election, they're sort of struggling after that last budget. It's probably true that they're unlikely to cut all that many funds from those areas. It's probably true that they just cut those funds from things like tax breaks for coal mining companies and stuff. We think that that is a good thing to cut funds from. That's quite good. So, unless this team is capable of proving to you much more confidently why the counterfactual is likely good, even if we get an inefficient industry, we still win this debate, because we explain that a diversity of industry globally, even if it's inefficient, is still better. Why do we think that Australia is still efficient regardless though? This team tells you sort of quite a few things about why they think the Australian industry would be very inefficient. Firstly, on energy costs. I think, firstly, there's sort of like a limited structural analysis as to why energy cost in Australia is likely to be very high. I think I would explain that Australia has lots of subsidies for renewable energy. Australia has the highest uptake of rooftop solar in the world, which just means that often we have an oversupply of energy in the grid. If you believe that these are largely automated processes, it's probably true that you can sort of vary when you are running these automated processes. It's probably true that you can do more processing during high supply, low demand times for energy, which means you're able to do this at quite a low energy cost. We also think it's true that when we have this domestic production of rare earths in Australia, it becomes much cheaper to build new renewable energy within Australia. We know empirically renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy because it has the lowest maintenance costs, because it does not have fuel costs. Which means that when you have greater accessibility to the resources required to make renewable energy, we think in the long run it's likely that the Australian energy system becomes much cheaper. Even if you believe that the Australian energy system is currently very expensive, we explain to you that the reason it is expensive is because we are sort of mid-transition. Once we finish that transition within sort of the next 10 years, it's likely this becomes extremely cheap. A country like China, which is still relying on like many fossil fuels, which is relying on the sort of rapid construction of like new large hydroelectric power plants, which are extremely expensive, which are prone to various environmental disasters, it's probably likely that if energy in those countries becomes much more expensive, we think we get a comparative advantage later on in the long term regardless. Secondly, on the idea that new infrastructure must be built. I think the analogy of using hydroelectric power plants for sewage is not very comparable in state. I think the much more accurate analogy is the fact that you can take coal power plants and use them and convert them to gas power plants or convert them to nuclear power plants quite easily. And the reason for that is that lots of the infrastructure which exists in various forms of processing, various forms of mining, various forms of energy production are all very similar between the different materials you choose to use. And the reason for this is when you do this processing, you probably just need the same sort of basic vats or whatever. You need the same sort of structures of your production lines. You probably need broadly the same area of sort of land. You'll probably want to build it in similar communities or whatever. And it's probably also true that these buildings are simply owned by the sort of companies that will now be moving into this renewable production, because we think that mining companies like to be quite sort of both vertically and horizontally integrated. Which just means that it's true that it's probably true that these companies that are losing all their coal infrastructure want a new thing to do with it. They have these large empty buildings. They're probably going to use it for this because that is a very cheap thing to do. It's unclear why the infrastructure is so terribly expensive. But regardless, we've just explained to you that this is a very short-term cost. It's unclear why that is so harmful in the long term. We think in the long term we get a massive benefit here. We'll know that even if it's expensive in the short term, we just have a lot of investment money that is going from the US into covering those short-term costs, because we explain the US as a massive investment to diversify this industry away from China. So even if it is expensive in the short term, it's unclear why that is so terrible. It's unclear why that means that the actual production cost of these rare earths is going to be more expensive in the long run, because those are only initial costs that have already been subsidised by investment. The next thing they say is, well, there aren't many engineers in Australia. I don't know. I think we've got like at least 3 engineers in the room right now. Probably well. I think there are lots of engineers. The mech they give is like, well, mining engineers make 500k a year. Yeah, so I think probably a lot of people want to do mining engineering. Maybe I'll switch that. That sounds like a good idea. So I think there are lots of mining engineers in Australia. I think when we shut down a bunch of coal mining, there's probably going to be an oversupply of mining engineers. I think it's quite intuitive that when you're doing a degree in mining engineering, you probably learn a lot about metallurgy, you learn a lot about chemical science, which means that these skills are largely transferable. I don't think you're required to import many people from other countries. I think Australia has plenty of capacity. We also do have some limited scope for refining already, which means we do have an industry that we can simply grow and expand. I don't think this will be all that expensive. Next thing they say is that shipping to Taiwan is more expensive. I don't know, you always need to ship to Taiwan anyway. We're just moving one step in the shipping process. I think that's inherently going to make it cheaper. Your argument here is China subsidizes it. I don't think this is OAV. I think they need to prove why China subsidizes it. I think intuitively, if China has a monopoly over something, there's no need for them to subsidize it. I think China is very unlikely to be subsidizing the shipping. I don't think that's true. The next thing they say is that they must compete with China on price. This is true. We explain why Australia has a comparative advantage. We explain why Australia is likely to put it at the same prices. I think they can still win. Last thing they say is that EV recycling is very bad, therefore we actually don't want more rare earths. Like, come on, obviously EVs are good. Even if you like struggle to recycle them in the status quo, we just explain that. The sort of energy processing at the point of like a power plant is much more efficient than at the point of an individual internal combustion engine. That is where the majority of environmental destruction of a vehicle comes. We obviously win on that. This is like basic scientific consensus. But regardless, we think that the sort of innovation that happens under our side when we have domestic refinement in Australia is likely to include innovation in recycling these rare earths. Because part of refinement is trying to extract those materials from a diverse range of sources, be that sources that you dig up from the ground or be that resources that you recycle from. We think it's quite likely that Australia has a strong incentive to try and develop recycling processes for these rare earths. That is a very, perhaps like cheap way to get more rare earths. We think this is true, we think they can do this. So, if you believe that the recycling problem for EVs is so horrible, we are the team that makes it much more likely that we get actual developments in the recycling of EVs. We win on those rounds. Just to remind you why we think that Australia is the best way to do this, is because our biggest benefit here comes in innovation. Because we know that Australia has a massive academic industry. We know that Australia has a massive engineering industry, which means we have a massive capacity to have these innovations. We explained to you that Australia has very good environmental regulation, that China has almost no environmental regulation, which means they are likely to do things that they're likely to just get much better industrial processes. This looks like less energy or chemical usage. This looks like less wastage of the product in the end. This looks like a higher purity of substances which can be used to make better quality electrons that are more efficient. Obviously, we win this debate on those macro brands.
Thanks. Second phone, you might want to grab your phone for the recording, Lazlo?
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome up Second Negative to continue this substantive portion of their team's case. Yeah.
I think this affirmative team has been a little bit silly with the counterfactual they're trying to construct here. There are two really important things you need to be aware of here to clarify this other debate. The first is that refining doesn't happen exclusively in China in the status quo, and that's not the world that we have to defend. There is a diversity of places where you can do refining. They point to Chile and Argentina in their speeches. Obviously, there's OIB, there's a very large refining industry in Indonesia, for example. There are lots of different places where refining happens in the world. The vast majority of refining of rare earth minerals happens in China, though. But what this means significantly then is that when you're talking about the comparative here of US investors investing in refining in Australia specifically, then if the debate is just about where US investors send their money, then the Australian government needs to aggressively grow the industry, needs to make specific tax concessions, specific kind of subsidies that make US investors prefer to invest in Australia over and above investing in Indonesia, Chile, Argentina, or wherever else it might be profitable to do this kind of rare earth refining. Obviously, demand for rare earth exists on both sides of the house. But secondly, I just don't think that you should let them get away with claiming that this is just US investors doing this, right? Like the info slide tells you that there is no significant refining industry in Australia in the status quo. Maybe things have changed in like the last 6 months and all of a sudden these refineries have sprung up in our backyards. But I just don't think that's true. So I don't think you should believe that there's massive amounts of investment going in the status quo. That means the Australian government has to make a series of really significant changes that make refining profitable. We gave you, apologies to Angus Braden, but Wollongong's quite close to Sydney. So 7 structural reasons why refining was likely to be very unprofitable in Australia. Why Australia didn't have a competitive disadvantage, in fact, in refining. I'm going to reiterate why we win that, extend it by proving that we have a comparative advantage in other things as well. But first, I'm going to talk about price stability, because I think that's a particularly silly piece of the affirmative team's case. 2 obvious mitigations here. Firstly, other countries do refining too. Secondly, China still dominates the market on their side of the house. Obviously, Australia only had 5% of the world's rare earth resources. Even if Australia takes a significant chunk of the market, China has the vast majority of the rare earths to start with. They have the vast majority of the refining capacity. That doesn't go away. So all of their mechanisms about price stability are quite weak, because the market power that Australia has relative to China isn't actually that big, and the market power that China has relative to the rest of the market doesn't change that much by adding one extra player. But furthermore, I just don't think it's in the interests of the CCP to behave in a really bad way on the global rare earths market. I think there's a perception that the West is quite averse to these kinds of price shocks. Obviously, there's a fear of losing market share to other countries. So, at worst, if the CCP disrupts the market at all, they're likely to do it by deliberately subsidizing things by making them as cheap as possible, which means that negative accrues all of the benefits that Affirmative wants to bring on cheaper EVs and what have you there. And trade wars don't matter, because the vast majority for these rare earth metals, of the market for these rare earth metals, was probably in places like the EU, where people actually drive EVs, not in the US, where the trade war exists, where people never actually use them. Okay, so where is refining cheaper, and why is refining in Australia a particularly bad idea? There were 7 reasons why just firstly, I think you should probably assume at the top of this that a massive state subsidy and investment and tax concession program that the affirmative team's case probably demands does probably represent a relatively inefficient economic system. So I think you should just inherently be skeptical of claims that Australia is particularly good at an industry that no one in Australia has decided it's economically profitable to do. Which means I think that the burden on Affirmative was to prove that the Australian government expressively expanding this would be a tipping point to creating a market that is actually an industry that's long-term profitable and cheaper. And I don't think they ever did that, and they just can't, because the economy of scale just doesn't exist in Australia. The supplies of rare earth metals in this country are not that big. Even when supplies are that big, the infrastructure doesn't exist to transport them. Maybe you have a really good road network around the country, but if you're mining rare earths in off the Pilbara or somewhere, you don't have the gas supply, or if you don't have the energy supply there to then be refining them there as well, then you have to be shipping them to a port on the other side of the country where you might want to be refining things where their coal refining stuff they claim exists over in the Latrobe Valley mining system, and that just doesn't work. You can't import lithium into the port of Melbourne. So Yeah, 7 structural reasons, I guess. Existing infrastructure doesn't work. We told you 2 reasons. Firstly, the refining infrastructure just doesn't exist in the first place. But secondly, even if it does exist, you don't have refining infrastructure that's specific to rare earths. And this is important because I know this is not chemically, technically the correct term, but rare earths are very volatile things. So it is, again, quite hard to manage. They react very easily. So you need to have specialized things. You need to use specialized materials to make sure that to process them in a safe way that makes them, if your lithium thing fucks up, then you blow up your refinery, and that's quite bad. Secondly, the engineering capacity needed to be specific to refining that didn't exist. We explained why transport costs were likely much cheaper outside of the house, given that the end result was that you were building an EV in China anyway. It was cheaper to ship unrefined lithium from Australia to China and then refine the lithium in China and build an EV there, than to refine the lithium in Australia and then have a much more expensive shipping process for refined lithium from Australia to China and then build that. We explained that energy costs were likely to be more expensive. Their response was to say, well, you can just switch off your refinery when energy is expensive at night and then just run it for 3 hours a day when the solar panels are cheap. Obviously, that's a ridiculous way to run a factory. That's not how these industrial processes work. And then finally, we told you labor costs and also Ziggy's own material on environmental protections obviously make this more expensive. So you should believe that there's a competitive disadvantage on refining in Australia. But secondly, Australia has a comparative advantage on extraction. This is different from a competitive advantage. It's not about how good we are relative to other countries. It's to say that the most productive thing to do in Australia specifically is extraction. The intuition here is to say that if I'm an executive if I'm a really, really good lawyer and I can bill myself at $100,000 an hour, maybe I'm also really, really good at typing, but it's still in my interest to employ someone who's a secretary who's worse at typing than me, because the cost per hour of typing is just not in my interest to do that work. It's in my interest to do the work I have a comparative advantage at, which is being a ridiculously good lawyer who gets heaps of money rather than wasting my time. I could be earning $100,000 an hour on that, so then on typing. The same thing works for investment, which is to say that Australia has a comparative advantage at extraction. We're very, very good at digging things out of the ground and putting them on ships to China. We have a comparative advantage of that relative to everything else. It's the most productive sector of our economy by far, which means that it is the most efficient thing for people to invest in. Which means, so the best use of your investment dollars in Australia are investing in digging things out of the ground and shipping them to China. We have a comparative disadvantage because you're reallocating financing from competitive to uncompetitive industries. But finally, the consequence of this was that the government was spending huge amounts of money on subsidising and investing in an industry that just wasn't profitable. I think you can't just hand wave away and say that there are bad government spending. Obviously, governments care about spending in really good ways. If you have to spend all of this, you're probably taking away from government spending in general, because it's likely to be bad. So that's why we're so proud to oppose.
Thanks for that fine speech, Second Negative. I'd like to welcome up Side Affirmative to conclude the substantive portion of Side Affirmative's case. Yeah.
Yeah.
The first thing I want to engage with is the concession that comes from Second Negative in saying that Australia does have a competitive advantage on extraction. If you read the info slide, we support the refinement and production of rare earth minerals, where Australia is the 4th largest producer of rare earths. The production is getting them out of the ground and getting rare earth minerals. So if that is true, we do more of that. We are the side that obviously gets far more, right? But even if you don't believe that, there's obviously diminishing returns if we do more and more production. So if both sides are going to make new mines or build new things and push huge amount of investment, you'll believe that our type of investment in building refineries is far more efficient than doing more mines. So that already loses some debate. Let's first deal with their reasons why this is likely to be expensive, and then I'll talk about our impacts as a result, because they sort of interact with each other. First, they claim that this is likely to be super expensive. I'll first talk about each individual mechanism they give, then I'll talk about the impacts they're linked to. First, they said that there are high energy costs. But obviously, if energy costs are high, then the cost of transporting it to a whole other country, whether in Indonesia or China, is going to be far greater. So that is obviously a huge cost that they can see to. But secondly, along with a lot of their other mechanisms, things like high labour costs, or where engineers are highly paid, or the fact that you need to build new infrastructure, what they don't understand, I guess the crucial thing here is this is something that is privately invested in, right? So firstly, their example of snowy hydro doesn't work because snowy hydro is a government project, whereas there are better private incentives like competition and innovation, and actually, you're accountable to your own shareholders and things like that. And the fact is that obviously companies have incurred expenses when they're making an investment. Obviously, an investment, you need to build new things, but the reason that investments are made is because you can make a profit in the future. These, I know that it's not an argument in the debate to say that there's a reason they're doing this or there's a reason they're not doing this, but this is something that the US and Australian government and these private investors and these private companies have themselves decided to do. You will not believe that they're so silly as to obviously be going into a venture that simply loses them money and will simply fail and crash into the future. But additional responses. Yes, we're happy to say that this may take time. Obviously, infrastructure may take a year or two or a few years to build, but the long-term impact is still great. And even in that time that the building is likely to occur, we don't incur a harm, right? Because we can presumably still ship our rare earths to other times while this stuff is in the building phase. The third thing they say is that there's a lack of engineering, and there's not many specific mining refinery engineers. We don't respond to this by saying there's a lot of engineers in Australia, obviously. But the other thing is just because there's no subject saying lithium refinery in university doesn't mean that the engineers or the metallurgists don't know this. For example, there are for instance maybe octopus biologist specialists in the wild, but they wouldn't do a uni course on octopus biology. Refinery is something that is taught in things like chemistry or metallurgy or engineering courses, which mean or at least is something that can be picked up. And the worst thing is, and I guess the last even if is, if you believe this team and they say that they're gonna we don't have engineers so we can import them to the US, which will be more expensive. Sure, we'll just import them from the US for an extra salary a year. That is still something that can still get the expertise to give us a huge return into the future, which is what this project is likely to do. The fourth thing they say is that fourth thing they say is you'll have to transport them anyways because, for instance, Australia doesn't do the final step. For instance, they don't make semiconductors. The first thing to note is that sometimes Australia is doing the final step, in those instances that is true. Secondly, there are also instances where Australia is presumably shipping to countries close by them. And also, the comparative on their side is that you have to ship to China. You have to pay a premium to China for them to refine it for you. And you obviously have to incur the huge amounts of transport costs and all the supply shops that make it occur on them. China is not close to us, right? You do have to ship it quite a way, especially if you're on the south side of Australia. Which means that having a domestic thing in terms of transport costs is obviously comparatively far better on our side. The intuition here is you just have to weigh even anything you believe in terms of their arguments on cost on the fact that this is something that these private investors in these countries decided to do, and on the fact that obviously the premium that China charges and the transport cost of getting into China, whatever other country this team decides on to refine them there, is obviously going to be far greater. Which explains that this isn't probably something that's going to lose money. So even if it is a trade-off between short-term money and long-term money, we're going to make a better return on this. We're going to make money on this. So if they think that Australia wants to, Australia needs to spend money on things like welfare, we'll do more of that in the future, which we can co-opt their benefit, right? But I also want to contest the impact, because they say that this money will be cut from other areas, things like NDIS, First Nations communities. Firstly, we point out that this was something that came primarily from US investment, and this is just OIB. I guess the lower intuition thing here is Alba went to the US a while ago to make a deal. This was one of the big deals that came out of it, which would have been front page newspapers. And I guess it is just a simple deal in that obviously Australia gains better refineries to be able to domestically refine and produce the rare earth minerals better. And America gets a laneway and a pathway to access a huge amount of rare earth without the tariffs that other countries like China might impose. So this is something that empirically happened. It is mainly US. Already to list their argument. But even if this is not true, we could explain that labour is in power, so not going to cut things like NDIS or First Nations or welfare to First Nations communities. But thirdly, even if you don't believe that, it is just unclear that these things need an excess of funding or an excess of money, right? Because the NDIS is subject to a huge amount of auditing right now. Oftentimes a lot of welfare payments can be inflationary. Australia is already one of the highest welfare states in the world. The OIB is not all the super left-wing person that we think we need to also give more and more welfare. Obviously, giving these things comes at a cost of things like investment, comes at a cost of things like inflation, which means that you will not believe their impacts, even if you believe all of the reasons that they give are true. Fourthly, we obviously get long-term profitability in the future as well, because this is something that does not lose money, as we explained. What are our impacts then? Having explained that they don't have any impacts. Firstly, we explained that this makes rare earth supply more stable and resilient to shocks. I want to deal with this first because this is the least responded to. And I would note that this is shocked in terms of like, Chinese decisions, but also in terms of like general, right? Like maybe a certain channel becomes closed in the future and it's harder to ship from China or to another area. It means that Australia can fill in those jobs. And to those specific countries who also may be tariffed from China individually, that is also a huge intense benefit, right? What are their responses? First, they say that other countries are fine too, which is like, I guess they mitigate this. Firstly, like they underplay the amount 5% or 8% is, right? Like Australia is a country that has a tiny portion, 8% of all the rare earth minerals in the world is an enormous amount, and especially enough, and it is literally enough to literally be the entire supply of entire countries who may not need that much. That is a huge amount. But secondly, there would be specific and intense impact on specific countries in certain instances. So maybe the impact is diffused if the entire global supply is shut down. Well, for instance, if China tariffs one specific country, that country can now buy from Australia, which is a huge benefit in terms of the cost of every single person in that country, which is still intense. But thirdly, they say that the CCP obviously has incentives to make this cheap and things like that. Like, firstly, they probably have a greater incentive now, insofar as they don't have the functional, what's the word called, monopoly on this. But secondly, the CCP has other incentives, which means that they do have the power to, for instance, enforce these things and not make it cheap. Firstly, they have huge, power imbalances between a lot of countries. For example, they've done a lot of investment in this country, they give loans to these countries. Secondly, they have a huge strongman image, which is they want to appear strong. Think about the fact that they never budged on the trade war, on the tariffs between the US and China. They're not going to budge and seem weak, and because they're going to pursue things that is to their own desires. But lastly, and obviously, China has recently, especially very recently, continued to develop their self-independence, and they're trying to become less dependent on other countries, which means they obviously have the capacity to do things that ruin that relationship with other countries, because they are much more self-sufficient nowadays. Which explains that these things are incredibly likely. And I would note that this is independent of whether you believe this costs more or not, because when these supply shocks happen, costs go so high that even if our process is more inefficient, then the relative benefit that we can provide to these countries that often need things like batteries is immense. The last thing we explain is that this increases global supply and decreases global costs, especially into the long term. Because there is a competitive competition mechanism, because you don't have to pay this premium to China or pay these transport costs, or because we have existing expertise, which means you have a comparative advantage. They give us a number of responses. The first set of responses say that Indonesia has the first mover advantage, Australia has a relatively small supply, and China can expand on this. But this is uncomparative, because obviously if Australia can do more and refine more rare earth minerals, there's obviously more supply and therefore decreasing the cost broadly. But secondly, China can only expand so much to get marginal returns, and oftentimes other governments can be quite corrupt. They also don't respond to transport, and obviously the difference is you're shipping to China and shipping it somewhere else. It's obviously far more expensive than doing it directly. For all those reasons,
Alright, thanks Third Affirmative for that fine speech. To conclude the substantive portion of this debate, I'd like to welcome up Third Negative. Ziggy.
First to clear up in today is the likely counterfactual and how government versus private investing plays into this. So firstly, the question is it just going to be US investors funding this whole thing? Firstly, the info side says that this is not happening at the moment, and we think that we respond to this quite adequately at second. But even so, you have to consider that there are a lot of other countries to invest in, right? And particularly when you have countries that already have some sort of refining facility, it makes so much more sense for the US to invest in these places rather than Australia and to build everything up essentially from scratch, right? Because a closed down mine is not the same as a pre-existing mining facility. So we think that it's quite unlikely that the US is going to be able to fund this entire project just because they want to, when there's already more favourable places to do it. And even if it is, it requires huge amounts of support from the Australian government because of the material that we already give you about costs going up and about people's compliance and about whether or not people want this new infrastructure built, particularly with pre-existing failed projects, even if they're not about conversions. but people don't tend to want, new things being built in the areas, in regional areas. And we already bring this to you at first, particularly on points such as like the risk about, things blowing up your entire farm when you're in a regional area, and just the fact that people often don't want things being built in their area if it's not going to give them a job, right? If you live in these regional areas and you're not an engineer who's going to be paid $500,000, why you would be in support of this? So the government has to probably cut spending elsewhere, and at worst, it does cut support and incentives from other more productive industries. But what we think is likely is that it's going to cut specific funding because, we tell you things about like NDIS, and we think that this is empirically true because the government has previously done so. And as much as you can say that it's controversial, it still happened, and we think that potentially it will continue to happen. And oftentimes, the cuts from funding do come from particularly vulnerable stakeholders. This is quite common, and even so, we still think that it's going to be cut from very productive industries. And the impacts of this are very, very big, right? It impacts all of the Australian people and makes it very difficult for something or a project like this to be successful, to be efficient. But we bring you that all the way down the bench anyways. Okay, on the counterfactual and on engineers. Firstly, we think that this is a particularly rare field. So if you think about the infrastructure, right? Having drills and mine infrastructure and all these things underground is very different from refining infrastructure. So having giant stainless steel vats, transfer pipes, reaction control. We don't think it's enough to say that there's a mine that's been shut down and now that's going to be very inexpensively turned into some sort of refining facility, okay? It's a mine. That is not the same as refining. Even though the things they give you on how it's not about physical labor tell you that if there's all these chemical processes going on that are quite unique, quite different, it's going to be quite a big effort to create these things, and it's going to be very expensive. We don't think that they can get away from that. So if you buy that infrastructure, is undoubtedly expensive, and it's probably going to take more than 1 or 2 years. Let's be realistic. Our project in Australia take a diabolically long time. They just go on forever. It's not going to be 1 or 2 years and then suddenly we're refining all our coal. Their benefits are completely contingent on, firstly, a significant investment from the US and pre-existing infrastructure on labor, or ultimately Australia's ability to influence the market significantly and countries' willingness to send raw materials to Australia if that's not the case, right? So there's a lot of uncertain and unlikely premises that have to occur at the same time. So firstly, significant investment to Australia specifically when there could be more favourable places to invest. Shutting down, turning those shut down mines into, refining facilities easily or efficiently or inexpensively, and then really low cost, which is quite unintuitive to Australia, which we already tell you, translating to then low refining costs so that you can then provide a significant benefit or a significant profit to the US investors and outcompete China enough to then lower prices with sufficient supply or agreement and support from rural areas, and then still make a profit at the end of this. And our case is just so much clearer and so much simpler, right? The counterfactual is that you have several pre-existing refining industries, and it doesn't make sense to take the risk for really any stakeholder when you could just invest in these and have sufficient production in those areas, right? So what we hear is that you're going to have lower prices, and China's going to lower the prices because of the competition from Australia, and that way we're going to get lower prices overall. But we think that they can quite easily outcompete Australia on prices, right? There's always the risk that people aren't going to buy from Australia significantly, or even if Australia's 8% is enough to supply a couple of countries, that's likely to get used up very quickly, considering it's still 8% compared to 92%. Okay, so Australia gets bought up. You know what? Now China has free reign to once again control their monopoly as they seem to think will occur. We don't think that Australia's 8%, however significant, is going to make a very significant impact on the market and prevent this a severe monopoly that they think is going to happen, that China's just going to increase their prices arbitrarily to whatever they want. We just think this is not the case, right? And that's all if you assume that the prices are going to be significantly lower in Australia, which we already think is unintuitive and unlikely, and we respond to that all the way down the bench anyways. Okay, and even so, if China has so much control, we think that given Australia only has 5% of our resources, and by their own analysis, China controls so much of the market, I think that the only way this really works out is if other countries that have natural resources then send to Australia instead of China. There are a couple of issues with this. Firstly, Australia is quite far from a lot of other countries, and we think that it's very expensive to send those resources to us. So Australia would have to buy the natural resources then refine it, and then make a profit, sending all those things all the way back to, Korea, right, or Taiwan to actually make the productive chips and productive technology. Like, we just don't think they prove why anyone would want to ship to Australia, given that it's often further away. Their main push is that, we just have enough in Australia to, have a significant impact on the market and, make a big profit for our investors, for the country, like whatever. We just think that this is quite unlikely. And like, if you assume that pre-existing suppliers to, China aren't going to change where they supply to because they haven't given you significant reasons for that, then we think that it's unlikely that they would leave pre-existing trade agreements or take the risk on Australia and take the risk on all of our apparently new innovation that we're going to get. And then even so, we'd have to send things all the way back to, Asia, and we just think this is going to hike up the price so much, considering they themselves think that transport is a significant influence on why these resources cost so much. Okay, then addressing the point of expertise. We think that labor costs are high, right? Like, if we agree, engineers get paid maybe 500k, it doesn't really matter. We think that it still stands that this is going to be much higher in Australia than a country like China, than a Southeast Asian country. Like, it's obviously going to cost so much more to pay people here, and we think the issue is this. It's like, even if people want to do that and get paid that much, like, this has to be reflected in the cost of refining and how much we need to charge for our final products in order to make a profit for it and make it actually be a productive industry. So we think that it makes much more sense to just, if we want to have innovation that, makes things more efficient, is good for the environment, and people are going to do this because it makes the processes cheaper because you're wasting less resources, we can still develop these technologies in pretty much any country, right? If Australians are so smart and we're all genius engineers, how about we develop that technology? We have incentive to do this because if you sell it to China, you're going to make a lot of money from that. So we think that all the benefits that they get, if it's such an important environmental issue, that can still be addressed without taking all the massive risks that you only get a benefit from, provided that it's going to be affordable or reasonable to build all of this infrastructure, and then as a result of that, somehow make enough of a profit to offset that, or at least make enough of a profit to offset the risk of that initial investment, and then prevent China becoming a monopoly, which we think is unlikely anyways. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech, though negative. We now move into the reply portion of this debate, where speaking times are halved and speaking positions are swapped. So I'd love to welcome up negative reply to open up the reply portion. I love replies.
I think it's pretty obvious that the counterfactual that the affirmative team had to, the counterfactual the affirmative team had to defend was having some government support. The motion says the Australian government aggressively growing the industry. Obviously, this requires the Australian government doing something, right? Not just existing and having signed a trade deal and then it all being okay. But notice as well, panel, that affirmative has to defend refinement and production specifically, which means that even if the government does nothing on their side of the house, that means our worst case is just all of this investment being reallocated somewhere else. And what we told you was that the comparative advantage in investment was on extraction specifically. That was the analysis we gave you at second negative. That wasn't a damaging concession, as third affirmative put it. This actually meant that our side of the debate got the cheapest production of rare earths and the cheapest refinement. Because we didn't waste our time trying to refine the shit in Australia, we just shipped it up to China where that happened. And because they have to defend refinement and production specifically, if the world we have is just production and not refinement, that's still a legitimate counterfactual, and that's a crushing victory for side negative, because it means the cheapest possible production of rare earth metals. It means all of the benefits that affirmative claims accrue in terms of the long-term price of lithium. It also means we get the most tax revenue for the Australian government because it's the most productive industry that has all the investment, is the most productive investment then for the tax situation. But I think the counterfactual did obviously require government spending, and government spending going in one place requires governments cutting in other places. The incentives for governments to have balanced budget were quite obvious. The OIV knows that Labor has already been cutting the NDIS, so you can't just say that they're not going to do it anymore. I don't see why they would keep doing it. And look, maybe welfare in some situations is bad, as Third Affirmative says, but do you actually think that people with disabilities having dignity is an important thing? I think it is. I think these are good things. I think that OIV thinks those are good things. You should weigh this debate on certainty, because we give you a certain impact. There's a certain consequence of governments choosing to spend money in some ways over others, rather than a very speculative chain from if we produce rare earths in Australia, then maybe it gets cheaper to make a rare earth metal, and then maybe it gets cheaper to make an electric vehicle, and then maybe everyone in America decides to stop buying Ford Raptors and starts buying the new Tesla Model S. So I think, but let's explain why it's not going to be cheaper either. Look, we gave you a whole lot of reasons to do this. I think the most important ones was that energy costs in Australia were likely to be high. Even if you buy their mitigation that energy costs in Australia will be cheap in 10 years' time, there's no reason to believe that they won't be cheap in China in 10 years' time as well. And obviously they have to bear that 10 years right now. I think their benefits are not that big if they have to delay any progress on the transition, on electrification 10 years while waiting for electricity prices in Australia to reduce. Obviously, to solve climate change was a pressing issue right this second. They had to prove immediate benefits if they wanted to claim a benefit here. We also had the mechanisms on the lack of infrastructure and the shipping. Their other claim was to say that you get a more stable lithium market, and that's a good thing. But this required you to believe that there were countries out there that actually bought refined lithium. But can I ask you, what was the setup in this debate for the uses of refined rare earths? The uses of refined rare earths were producing computer chips and producing batteries and those kind of technologies. The batteries are all made in China. The computer chips are all made in Taiwan and Korea. So maybe computer chips get more expensive if China decides to stop selling things to Taiwan and Korea. I don't know why that's a big deal, but what is this battery being produced in China then destroys their entire mechanism, because Australia can't make the market for batteries cheaper unless we're building the batteries in Australia, and that was never something that they could claim happening on their side of the house. So if you care about protecting those people most vulnerable at risk of government spending cuts, you have to vote negative.
Thanks, negative reply. And to conclude the debate as a whole, affirmative reply. Here.
You gotta spend money to make money. This reply is just going to assume that for some reason the Australian government had to spend huge amounts of subsidies. I don't know why this is necessarily likely what Australia would do, but I'm going to assume this is true and still one clearly. First, they explained that there's maybe a short-run cost. I'm going to explain this is relatively low and unimportant. The first reason why there's a short-run cost is that you need lots of specialized labor. One, both teams concede you need only a few engineers. Two, both teams concede there's pretty high supply. There's been layoffs in other industries. One of themselves say you get engineers from America. So this seems like there's a low demand but very high supply, which leads to a low average cost. Second claim, there are high startup costs. And we explain, look, existing infrastructure is probably pretty close. They're like, well, obviously it's not one-to-one, but that was never our claim. Our claim was just simply a lot of the similar facilities, buildings, planners, expertise, startup costs already kind of existed there, so there's a reduced initial cost. Their third claim is to say, well, you would need to cut welfare. One, we explained most of this investment already came from private Americans, but secondly, Albo is unlikely to specifically cut welfare for indigenous and disabled people. But thirdly, even if who cares, they actually never explain why the NDIS is good in of itself. OIV's probably read some headline about how there's a role in the NDIS at some point, if they are maybe Australian in Australian newspapers. So I don't know why this is a harm. Lots of people freeload on welfare. I don't know why it's important. The fourth thing they said is, well, maybe you'll have to cut from other effective forms of investment in production. But what Free A explains is, one, there's already diminishing returns, like you can have only so many mines in the world. But secondly, obviously this is the lowest input and profitability part of the industry. Like raw lithium, like anyone can just dig that shit out of the ground. You're competing against the most of the world in the first place. So it's probably not that profitable. They finally say, well, maybe the government won't do it well. One, weak analysis on why government bad. Two, all of their examples are subsidies and tax breaks, which are things governments do to incentivize private companies that still have a profit incentive. So it seems pretty unlikely that we have like a ministry of cobalt doing this, or a ministry of like lithium production, like ripping it out of the ground. I want to weigh up all their mechanisms. One, probably pretty short run, like probably over time we just build the infrastructure, we just get the experts in, energy grids adapt. Number two, it's a pretty speculative trade-off on welfare. Like, I don't know, like this is the specific industry that's come. And number three, it's not an active debate. This hurts rich Australians, fuck it, I don't care. People in developing countries deserve way more, they can starve to death Australians, who cares, they have plenty of safety nets. Let's weigh up the long run and why it was up to the debate. Their only piece of mitigation on this is, well, maybe Australia is not that important in the rest of the world. But one, Free A explains that because Australia makes up a disproportionate amount of the deposits in the world, that we have an outsized influence. That secondly, just because 8% of deposits in the world are only 8%, it's not like all deposits in the world are being used at the same time, right? Like still as a proportion of used deposits, it's fairly large. But finally, like 8% of the world's deposits are still like 1 billion tons of lithium. Like I'm sure that's enough for like a year or two. Like I'm sure China doesn't need that much lithium. Batteries are pretty small. Why is our long-run benefit so debate-winning? One, we have a more secure proximity. It means you get more consistent inputs, which is the highest cost is transportation in the first place. It means that you don't have to spend as much time, petrol, cars, paperwork, and red tape. Our second big benefit is we get higher levels of expertise in Australia, which means we get more innovation, which reduces costs for consumers in the long run, but also reduces the environmental cost in our policy, which the OIV probably likes trees and shit like that, which means they're probably pretty upset when these plants like actively destroy the environment, accidentally stop my watch, whatever. The third reason why we win is we get a lower price, which helps people all around the world, which helps people with the lowest average wages, like people in developing countries, who now can afford batteries, who are now more likely to buy BYD, the cheap Chinese electric vehicles that the OIV knows exist. Finally, we explained there's better price stability as competition drives prices down and you're insulated from price shocks. And the reason why price shocks are likely is, as we explained, that there is a more demand for EVs than chips. There's an AI race currently going on. At the end of this debate, we get cheaper prices for the people who need it the most. Fuck Australians, go to the rest of the world, proud to propose.
Thanks for the reply for that reply. I encourage you now to cross the floor, shake hands, and then we'll see you back in hopefully no more than 15 minutes for the oral adjudication.